Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Fred Nauer. I'm the Assistant Chief Flight Instructor at Thunderbird Aviation. And today we'll be talking about, in IFR operations, what happens if you have two-way radio communications failure. We'll start out with some slides and then we'll switch over to my Flight to use it to demonstrate an example of all the different portions of the regulation. We'll go both through the two-way radio communications failure portion and also what you need to see at the end of your approach to be able to descend and land at the airport. For those of you who are looking real close, you can see my cat Ira behind me on his cat tree. He likes to listen up there when I do these seminars once a month. So let me switch over to the slideshow. So IFR operations, two-way radio communications failure, the rule and the reality. Oops, look at that. So first we'll talk about 91-185, which is the regulation that talks about the what do you do during two-way radio communication failure. So we'll talk about what happens, what does the reg say about if you are VFR or obtain VFR somewhere along the route. The second part there, the Avenue F, is what everybody uses in my little school to remind themselves what route you have to choose to fly. Then the MEA is what altitude you're going to fly. And then the last thing is basically split into two parts. So there's basically 5 things you have to worry about if your radio's quit. And the last 2 are, when do you leave the clearance limit, depending on what kind of clearance limit you have. And then the second thing we'll talk about is 91-175. The when can you descend, what kind of visibility you need, and what do you have to see at the airport in order to be able to do that descent in the first place. So anybody, now we got more people coming in. So the first thing is on the screen right now, the first thing you want to do before you start doing all the stuff that the regulation talks about is if your radio's quit, is troubleshoot the situation to make sure that there's no way that you could possibly talk out of the radio itself. So the first thing you want to do, especially from a CFI standpoint, because I'm guilty of this more than anybody else, is make sure that the volume on your radio is turned up enough to be able to hear the person. Now that's happened both because I'm the one who turned down the volume, but the other time that's happened is when I was flying around between Arizona and Texas about 10 summers ago, and I was flying IFR on a beautiful bright sunny day, and Albuquerque Center transferred me over to somebody in Texas. And when I switched over to the new frequency, I listened really carefully with my noise reduction headsets on. I could hear somebody talking after I did my little, after I told them, gave my speech about where I was when altitude I was flying. And I realized that the antenna that I was talking to was way far away. And so sometimes you just have to turn up the volume just because, maybe not so much here in Minnesota, but other places in the country, you may have to turn up the volume just because of the distance between you and the antenna of the person you're trying to talk to. Second thing on the troubleshoot side is always make sure that the frequency that you have dialed into the radio is the actual frequency that you're trying to talk onto. May have swapped some numbers around or something like that. If you have more than one radio in the airplane, obviously always check the other radio to make sure that works. Most of us are flying with headsets now, so if your headset has gone bad, then, you always make sure that you have a microphone in the cockpit with you so that you can talk on that way, and go back to the way it was way back last century when nobody had headsets and you had to turn the volume way up to hear them talk through the little speaker that's usually just above your head in the middle of the cockpit. The thing to remember about, so the other thing to remember is most of the time when you have your headsets plugged in, you have the comm panel all set up and everything to have the communication from the radio and the intercom go to your headsets. If you're going to go to the, if you're going to have to use the speaker because your headset went bad, figure out what on your comm panel or inside your airplane you have to do to get the speaker to turn on. Some airplanes, it's automatic. The speaker is always on. Sometimes it's a push a button. Sometimes it's twist a knob. So just, it just depends on what your situation is in your airplane. So the first part about 91-185, the regulation on two-way radio communication failure, the first thing it talks about is what happens if you're VFR. If you're VFR at the time that if you're on an IFR flight plan and you're VFR at the time the radio quit, or sometime during the stuff we're going to talk about, if you're not in VFR, but you attain VFR later on in the flight, then you're supposed to remain VFR and land as soon as practical. That's the, so most people, that's why I'm talking about this today, trying to, didn't see any of my students up here, but make sure that they know about all the things. The first thing in the regulation is the VFR. If you're VFR at the point of radio failure, or you get VFR sometime later, don't go back in the clouds, stay VFR and land as soon as practical. So the next thing is the paragraph that talks about what route to fly. Everybody uses the acronym Avenue F. So the letter A stands for your assigned route. This is usually going to be the one that you wrote down before you left the ground when you called ATC to get your clearance in the first place. The CRAFT that everybody uses to write down the clearance from clearance delivery, whether you've attained that on the ground or you got that while you're flying around VFR in the air. The assigned route is the one you're most likely going to get from ATC most of the time before the flight starts. The V in Avenue F stands for vector. These are not in order of importance, like some people think. There's some study guide floating around that says is AVEF in order of importance, but in the vector situation, if you're on a vector at the time your radio quits, you're supposed to leave the vector at the point of radio failure and then go to the assigned route, or the other two that we're going to talk about here in a second, whichever you have available to you at that time, whatever route you have available to you at the time the radio quits. But if you're on a vector, even if it says, fly runway heading, expect on course in 10 minutes, they don't expect you to stay on course for that full 10 minutes. As soon as the radio quits and you're on a vector, leave the vector. You either go to your assigned route or to a route you were told to expect in a further clearance. If while the radio is working, they gave you a different, they told you, here's fly this route, expect something at this intersection, then you would also fly that part. And finally, if you don't have an assigned route, or the assigned route has disappeared, you don't have an expected further clearance route, then finally you fly what you filed to the flight service station at the beginning of the flight, and before you took the flight out in the first place. So whether you're using 188 or weather brief, the .com, or calling them on the phone, or using ForeFlight, whatever you filed into ATC, if the radio is quit and you don't have and your assigned route has disappeared, your expected route has disappeared, then fly what you filed. So the priority is assigned route, expected route, or filed route in that order. Assigned route has priority over the other two. So the second thing is, what altitude are you going to fly? Everybody uses the acronym MEA for this to remind themselves what are the three things that we have to determine what altitude we're going to fly. But it's tricky, because then some of my students will say, well, the M in MEA is MEA. No, it's not. It's minimum altitude for IFR operation. And that includes the IFR operation altitudes includes all three of these. MEA, the minimum en route altitude, the altitude on the airway that will make sure that you have obstacle clearance. And if it's a Victor airway at the altitudes most of us fly, if it's a Victor airway, it also guarantees that you have nav aid reception for the entire route of flight. Another altitude that could be an IFR altitude that could be chosen for this is the MOCA, the minimum obstacle clearance altitude. The MOCA, you're guaranteed obstacle clearance along the entire route of flight, and you're only guaranteed nav aid reception if you're within 22 nautical miles of the nav aid. And finally, the last altitude for IFR operation is the AROCA. This is a fairly new thing, in the grand scheme of things. It's the off-route obstacle clearance altitude. If you're not on a Victor airway, if you're not on a GPS airway, you're just flying direct between 2 points, then you look at the low en route chart, and you look for the brown numbers printed on the chart. Those are the off-route obstacle clearance altitude. Those altitudes guarantee you 1,000-foot clearance in non-mountainous areas and 2,000-foot clearance in mountainous areas above the highest obstacle in the quadrangle, which is the square or the rectangle created by the latitude and longitude lines printed on the chart. The next altitude you have to choose from or think about when you're looking at what altitude to fly is the altitude you were told to expect in the further clearance. So most of this time, the time in the CRAFT would be climb to 2,500 feet, expect 10,000 feet, 10 minutes after departure. And finally, just from the way we have this reminder set up, is your assigned altitude. So you check the minimum altitude for IFR operation, the altitude you're told to expect in a further clearance, or your assigned altitude, and you pick whatever of those altitudes is the highest. I always write this down. It's not MEAF, meaning that your filed altitude is not a choice. The only thing that the filed works on is the route you're going to fly. So even though you may have filed for an altitude of 7,000 feet, if it's not the minimum altitude for IFR operation, it's not an altitude you were told to expect, it's not the altitude you were assigned, you cannot pick the filed altitude. It's only those three. So finally, the two things we have to worry about as far as clearance limit is at the end of your clearance that you got, if that clearance limit, cleared as filed, cleared to Fargo as filed, if the point you were cleared to is a point from which an approach begins, then you can leave that point and fly an approach at an expected further clearance time if one has been received, or if none has been received, then you leave that clearance limit at the estimated time of arrival. So now you got to remember, what time did I take off? How long did I tell them on my flight plan I was going to fly? And so what time was I supposed to be here to make sure that that time is either, now or in the past. If that's the situation, I can fly the approach right now. If not, I got to hold. If the clearance limit is not a fixed from which an approach begins, then there's two situations. The EFC apply, if one has been received, will apply to that clearance limit point. And then you fly past that clearance. But if you don't have an EFC, then you just fly right past the clearance limit and go to the point from which an approach begins. But then at that point, you have to worry about when is the ETA? Is that in the past, right now, in the future? If it's right now or in the past, you can fly the approach. If it's still in the future, you have to hold. So let's back up for a second. So the clearance limit. If you're, I've talked, my brother-in-law is a controller at Albuquerque Center, and I asked him about this, and about holding at the points, and he said, if you are a radio out and you're going someplace, if it's and it looks like you're going to get there early, if it's at all possible, please try to slow down so that your EFC, if you got one, or your ETA is in the past when you get there. Because especially if you're, like in the example we're about to use here, you're holding at the Fargo VOR, they have to clear the airspace for you while you're holding there. So basically what you've done is shut down the entire airport while you're holding. So if you have an EFC or you have an ETA, or if you have an EFC, try to get there, slow down enough so the EFC is in the pass. If you don't have an EFC and you have to work off the ETA, then slow down to make sure that the ETA is in the pass by the time you get there. Of course, obviously, don't slow down to the point where you're going to fall out of the sky, but just do the best you can to make the holding time as small as possible. Okay, so now, how would you apply this rule? Now, I'm going to give you this is what we filed. We're going to file KMIC, go for Victor 2 to the Fargo VOR. Our destination is Fargo Airport. And we filed at 4,000 feet because it keeps us above all the MEAs along the route, and it's a westerly heading. So we'll pick an even 1,000 for that altitude. But what we're going to be cleared for when we call up ATC before we take off from Crystal is we're cleared to the Weirda intersection via Gopher Victor 2. Climb and maintain 3,000 feet. Departure frequency is 126.5. Squawk 1234. Now, the last time I did this talk, somebody said I would never accept that clearance. And you're right, I wouldn't accept this clearance either. But for the purposes of demonstrating all the different stuff that you could possibly do as far as how the rule applies to a clearance like this, or how to apply all the various facets of the rule, let's use this clearance just as an example for what we're going to do today. So hang on a second while I transfer everybody over to my ForeFlight here. So let me stop sharing here so I can switch over to the other one. Share the screen. So for those of you who have ForeFlight, there is a scratch pad that you can download in ForeFlight that will allow you that has the CRAFT stuff written on the side there so that you can write it down in ForeFlight. So again, we're cleared to Weirda intersection via direct Gopher Victor 2, climb and maintain 3,000 feet. So those are that's the clearance we have to go with right now. So here we are at Crystal with our low IFR chart pulled up so that we can keep an eye on what we're doing. Let me get the traffic out of here so we can don't get. So let's say today that the winds are favoring runway 14. And so we're going to take off out of Crystal on a heading of runway 14, and it's a beautiful, bright, sunny day, not a cloud in the sky. We're just using our IFR clearance as kind of like fancy flight follow. So we take off out of Crystal. Tower says, flight runway heading, expect on course in 10 minutes, contact departure. We try to contact departure, we don't hear anything. We go through all the troubleshooting. We check the volume, we check the frequency, we check the other radio. We check to make sure our headset's okay. Nothing works. there's no way to communicate out of the airplane itself. So the first thing we're going to do then is squawk 7600. That's the emergency squawk for radio out failure. For those of you who've been at this for a long time, you used to have to squawk 7700 for a minute and then squawk 7600 for 10 minutes and then swap it back to make sure that ATC knew what was going on, because the bells and whistles would only go off if you squawk 7700. Nowadays, they finally got it figured out that if you squawk 7600, all the bells and whistles go off at ATC so they know that you have an emergency. But in this situation here where there's not a cloud in the sky, you're going to squawk 7600 and then you're going to turn around and fly back to Crystal and land at Crystal. Now, Crystal's a towered airport, so now you got to think way back to your memory banks about what are you going to see when you get on final on runway 14, because you just took off from there, so it's probably the runway they're still using. Get on final runway 14, what do you have to see from the tower in order to be able to land there? So remember, a steady green light means you're cleared to land. A steady red light means to give way to other aircraft, continue circling is the official term, but basically it is do a go around and stay in the pattern, and hopefully you'll be able to see a green light the next time you come around. If you come down finally and you don't see any lights, then do a go around, level off about the altitude of the tower and rock your wings while you're going down the runway so that you can get their attention, and hopefully you get a light the next time around. Okay, so back to the very beginning. We just took off runway 14, but now the clouds are at 500 feet overcast. Just after we enter the clouds, Crystal Tower says, fly runway heading, expect on course in 10 minutes, contact departure. We contact departure, we don't hear anything. We go through all the troubleshooting. We definitely have a radio problem. So now what are we going to do? So like we talked about before, we are on a vector right now. Flying runway heading is a vector. So what we're going to do is so if we're on a vector, since we have an assigned route of Gopher, Victor 2 to Weirda intersection, we're going to fly directly to the Gopher VOR. Since we're off route now and not on any particular airway, then the altitude we have to choose an altitude to fly. The minimum altitude for IFR operation, if you look up in the top part of my screen there, it said 36, the big brown number there. That's the AROCA number. We don't have an MEA or a MOCA to fly right now because we're not on an airway, and we were assigned 3,000 feet. So the altitude we're going to fly between now and the time we get to Gopher is going to be 3,600 feet, because that's the highest altitude of the minimum altitude for IFR operation. We don't have an expected further clearance altitude or the altitude we were assigned of 3,000 feet. When we get to Gopher, then we're going to fly Victor 2. Close that. And if you're on ForeFlight, and you've put Victor 2 in the flight plan, it'll tell you that you're on Victor 2, and even give you the MEA and the ForeFlight symbol there right on the chart. But if you can look, if you don't have that, you go to the Victor 2 symbol that's on the en route chart, the low en route chart itself, and we notice that the MEA now that we're on a Victor airway is 3,400 feet. We don't have an expected altitude. Our assigned altitude is 3,000 feet. So as we turn onto the course of 297 after Gopher, we're going to climb or descend down to 3,400 feet from the altitude of 3,600 feet that we were at. Then we're going to stay on Victor 2 and go past Sodi and Tilbat and a Comey and a Barre, and then we get to Alexandria. When we pass Alexandria, let's just get this, I always do this in my example in the end of course test I'm giving to my students. Right after you pass Alexandria at 3,400 feet, you look out the window and your tire is out of the clouds. your cockpit's in the clouds, but the bottom of the airplane is basically out of the clouds. Could you fly down to 3,000 feet, passing Alexandria, get VFR, remain VFR, and land as soon as practical? The way I read the regulation is, yes, you can, because since we were within 22 nautical miles of Alexandria, the minimum altitude for IFR operation at this point is the MOCA. The MOCA is 3,000 feet. That equals our assigned altitude is 3,000 feet. If there's a reason to go down to 3,000 feet, go down and do that. Now, if there's still 500-foot overcast all over the state and you cross Alexandria, yeah, then this doesn't work. There's no reason to go down to 3,000 feet. But if there's a reason, if you go down to 3,000 feet, you're going to get VFR, going to be able to stop all this mess and get yourself on the ground and call somebody on the phone and have somebody come out and fix your radios, then go ahead and do that. But if you're still in the clouds and it doesn't appear that the clouds are any better than they were when you took off, so then when you cross Alexandria, then the minimum altitude for IFR operation is going to be 3,500 feet because you're going to fly along the entire route after Alexandria. So now we got to go to the MEA of 3,500 feet. Then we continue on past Tiller intersection, past Panic intersection, and here we are at Weirda intersection. That's our clearance limit. There's no place, we have nothing. The clearance limit that we got in our assigned route is Weirda intersection. So since we can look at all the approach plates into Fargo and realize that Weirda intersection is not on any of the approach plates. So so now our clearance limit is not a fix from which an approach begins. We don't have an EFC, so we don't have to worry about holding because of the EFC time. And the ETA applies to the airport itself. So since we don't have an EFC, we're going to go right past Weirda, and the route we're going to fly past that, since the assigned route disappeared, we don't have an expected further clearance route, we're going to fly what we filed from Weirda the rest of the way. So we've got Victor 2 to Fargo. So past Weirda, we're just going to continue on Victor 2 at 3,500 feet until we get to the Fargo VOR. When we get to the Fargo VOR, that are on our way there, we got to figure out what approach are we going to fly. Now, at this point, we're going to have to use the weather information that we got when we filed way back before we left to see what the weather, and hopefully the weather is still going to be pretty much like that when we get there. So if we go to my list, I have Fargo memorized as one of my favorite airports. We go to all the procedures, and let's assume for right now that the weather is telling us that we're going to have to land to the north. So then I will always pick an approach that is going to give me the lowest altitude to fly to. So since we have to land to the north, I'm going to pick the ILS to runway 36. Let's look down here at the very beginning of the approach. So we're flying Weirda to Fargo at 3,400 feet. Then after Fargo, we're going to go out the 210-degree radial. Now the little number there says 2,800 feet, but the little arrow underneath that is not a thick black line. So that is not part of the approach. Fargo is not an initial approach fix. So the way I read the regulation is after we pass Fargo, we're going to have to stay, we could descend down to 3,000 feet from the 3,500 feet we were at hitting into Fargo. We could go down to 3,000 feet because we still have to pick the highest altitude, because right now that 2,800 feet is the minimum altitude for IFR operation. Our assigned altitude is 3,000 feet. We're going to have to stay at 3,000 feet till we get the day of, then we can go down to 2,800 feet while we're flying the arc. Then we'll get on the localizer, pick up the glide slope when we get to Opti intersection and start descending on down on the glide slope. Just as an aside here, the little V there at the 3 DME fix from the ILN, from the localizer antenna, is if you're flying the localizer and you see the runway from that point, and you're at the minimums for the localizer of 1360, you can continue, you'll be able to continue, go down to the airport with a 3-degree glide path. So we're looking over here at the airport itself. The PAPI lights we would see on runway 36 would be white, white, red, red. We'd be able to fly that down to the runway. But right now we're on ILS. We're assuming that the weather's really bad, so we need to fly the ILS all the way down. So now we have to worry about what do we need to see in order to be able to land at the airport. So let me stop sharing this. Go back to screen sharing. What do we need to be able to descend below decision altitude or the minimum descent altitude, depending on what kind of flight we're on? So the first thing in the rig is you must be continuously in a position where, with normal maneuvers and normal descent rates, you can make it down to the runway. So what that means, so what that means for us, for me flying out of Crystal, is if I don't see the airport until right at the missed approach point, I'm 500 feet in the air. There's no way I can do a normal maneuver on a normal descent rate and be able to get myself down to the runway and land, because it's only 3,000 feet long, or just a little bit more than that. But I've flown into Marquette, the airport near Marquette, Michigan now. It's a public airport, but it used to be K.I. Sawyer Air Force Base that was run by the Strategic Air Command. It had B-52s loaded with atomic weapons and KC-135s loaded with all sorts of fuel, so that in the Cold War, if the Russians decided to come across the pole, we could launch the fleet and go retaliate. So because everything was so fully loaded there, the runway there is built to be 2 miles. It was 2 miles long. Now that it's a public airport, so they don't have to, in the wintertime, don't have to plow the whole thing. They've knocked it back to 9,000 feet. But in that airport, if you see the runway right at the missed approach point, you've got 9,000 feet of runway in front of you. That's plenty of room from 500 feet in the air to be able to descend down using normal maneuvers and a normal descent rate. Yeah, you might not land in the first third of the runway, but for most of the airplanes that we fly, you'll have plenty of room left on the runway once you get down in order to be able to get the airplane stopped. The next part talks about the visibility. You must have the flight visibility prescribed in the approach. That's not what you read on the METAR report. It's not what you hear in the ATIS or the AWAS or the ASOS. It's what you're seeing out the window. If the flight visibility that you're seeing out the window at decision altitude or flying closer to the airport at the MDA is the same as the visibility prescribed in the approach, then you can descend below those and come in for a landing. But the last part then is that whole list of stuff. What do you have to see at the airport itself? I think when I was in the Air Force, it was real easy. The part said, and the runway environment in sight, period. In my mind, now that when I got to the civilian world, I had to memorize this whole 12-piece list. I think what happened was, in my mind, I went, okay, somebody said, oh, there's the McDonald's. So that's right next to the airport. So I have the runway environment in sight, and crashed and killed himself. So now they had to come up with a list of stuff of what you need to see in order to be able to land. What does the runway environment entail itself? So the way I break it down is this way. You got to see the runway lights are the runway markings. The threshold lights are the threshold markings. The touchdown zone lights are the touchdown zone markings. So the runway, everybody knows what that, like the lights Most of the time, if the lights are going to be on, they'll be running down the side of the runway. Very seldom are any of us going to be landing at an airport that spent the money to dig holes in the concrete to put centerline lighting in there. So the ones that run down the side of the runway are going to be white, and they're going to change to amber if the last half or the last 2,000 feet, whichever happens first. The threshold and the threshold markings everybody knows about. The threshold lights are going to be the green lights right at the end of the runway, or right at the threshold. Now, in the regulation of those of you who are following along in the book, if you happen to be doing that for 91-175, it doesn't say touchdown zone lights, touchdown zone markings, because the touchdown zone doesn't exist unless it's painted on the runway. But the way for my mind, it was easier to memorize it this way, where it was, runway, threshold, touchdown, the thing itself, the lights and the markings. And so I memorized it as a list of 9 instead of just a list of 8. The next thing on the in the regulation is the vertical glide slope indicator, which is now the generic term because we have both PAPIs and VASIs. The PAPI is the 4-light thing that sits off the side of the runway. On glide path is white, white, red, red. The PAPI stands for Precision Approach Path Indicator. The reason it's precision is because if you're slightly high, you're going to see 3 whites and a red. If you're slightly lower, you're going to see 3 reds and a white. The VASI is the far bar and the near bar situation, where the lights are separated. And to be on glide path, the far bar needs to be red, the near bar needs to be white. So red over white is a pilot's delight. If you see white over white, you're going to fly all night, meaning you're too high. If you see red over red, you're going to be dead because you're too low. If you see the runway and identifier lights, then you can go all down to the runway. And everything that we've talked about so far, if you see any of these things, just one of the things on this list right now, if you see any one of these things, you can go in for a landing. Descend below decision altitude, or MDA, minimum descent altitude, and go and fly all the way down to the runway and land. The last thing on the list, though, is the one that's tricky, because it's written like a lawyer. Basically, it's on the list of if you see it, you can land. But unfortunately, there's a caveat when we're talking about approach lights. Woo. Okay, so if you're talking about approach lights, oops, back. If you're talking about approach lights, there's 2 situations. They say approach lights, except that, this is what the reg says, except that unless you see the red terminating bars or the red side bars, you can only go down to 100 feet above touchdown zone elevation. Not another 100 feet, but 100 feet above touchdown zone elevation, whatever that is. Most of the time, you're right, it's going to be another 100 feet, but every once in a while, the decision altitude for an ILS approach is 250 feet instead of 200 feet for whatever reason. So in that case, if you're just going down another 100 feet, you'd be doing you would not be going down all the way that you possibly could. So what is it? So that's the tricky part. Approach lights, if you see the approach lights, if there's going to be red lights in it, we'll talk about what that means here in a second. If there's going to be red lights in it, then when you see the red lights, you don't have to see anything else on the list. You can just keep going down all the way down to the runway. But if the only approach lights you see are white, then you have to see one other thing on the list for the runway, the threshold, the touchdown zone, the vertical glide slope indicator, or the REILs, although the REILs wouldn't be there if you got approach lights, but anyway. See one other thing on the list before you can go all the way in for a landing. So now let's go back to my 4-flight. Go back to Zoom and share content from the screen, start the broadcast. So now what are we going to see at Fargo? As we kind of fly down the ILS, we get down to 1,099 feet, which is the decision altitude, and we look up, and what are we going to see? So the first thing on runway 36 is that the approach lighting system is designated as an A5. If we go to the top of the approach plate, it says that the A5 is a Mauser. The ALS is approach lighting system. So the M is medium intensity approach lighting system, and the R is the sequence flashing lights, which everybody else calls the red. Most of the flying that we're going to do, all the airports that I've noticed in that when I'm doing my IFR teaching, has an A5, a Mauser type approach lighting system. In that system there is no red lights. Hang on a second. The Mauser has the same lighting situation as the one up above, as the Seltzer does, and so it's all lights. The green light that you're seeing on this page here in the middle of the middle column there is the threshold lights. So if it's a Mauser, it's only going to be, so if it's a Mauser, you're only going to see white lights. The only one you're going to see red lights on is the A1 designation on the approach plate for ALS F1. That one has red terminating bars just before the green threshold lights. So you need to be fairly close to the airport before you can see those. The other one will be the ALS F2, which is the circle A on the approach plate. This one has the red sidebars. This is a little bit better situation because you'll probably see the red sidebar sooner. So you have, if you have a circle A or a circle A1 on your approach plate, then you can expect to see red lights inside the approach lighting system. But if more like most of the flying that we do, we're going to be in an A5, they're all going to be white lights, and so we're not going to be able to see very much. So then we need to see, then we need to see at least one other thing. So what are the other things we're going to see as we get into Fargo here? The A5 approach lights are only white, so we got to see one other thing. So the threshold lights, if they're on, are going to be green. The threshold itself, because it's an instrument runway, we got those piano keys on either side of center line. Now, at this point, I usually ask my students, well, how many of them are there going to be? The answer to that question is there's basically one stripe for every 25 feet the runway is wide on both sides of the runway. So since this runway is 150 feet wide, there's 6 stripes either side of center line. That's just trivia. You know, I'm not going to flunk somebody if they don't know that. I just like to ask them things that they don't know. So the threshold stripes are going to be there. The runway markings are going to be the big runway 36. The runway markings are going to be the big 36 just past that. The touchdown zone markings will be past the PAPI lights. We only have PAPI lights on this one, no VASI lights. Because the touchdown zone is, the way I tell my students is, if you fly white, white, red, red, and don't flare, you're going to crash right next to the PAPI lights, or right in the middle between the 2 VASI lights. But if you do the flare and then slow down enough to get the airplane to touch down, that's where the touchdown zone markings are. So they're going to be past. So if you're looking for the touchdown zone markings, they're going to be much farther down the runway if they're there at all. And they're obviously going to be on an ILS runway like this. So in this runway, we have the PAPI lights instead of the VASI lights because we got the circle P over there on the right side of the runway. The runway end identifier lights are only going to be at those instrument runways that don't have approach light systems too. So here at Fargo, the runway end identifier lights are only on runway 927. If you have approach lights, you don't have REILs. Now let's go back to the flying the approach. So if we get down to 1099 and all we see is approach lights, you go over to the airport diagram, the touchdown zone elevation is 899 feet. Since it's a A5 approach lighting system, doesn't have any red lights, if all we see is the approach lights and nothing else, we can continue down to 100 feet above touchdown zone elevation, which is 999 feet. Then we got to see one other thing on that list before we can come in for a landing. And the way I read the regulation is descent below decision altitude or MDA. So if for some reason you're flying the non-precision approach, the localizer approach, and you're still at 1380, when you get to the missed approach point and all you see is you get close and all you see is the approach lights, then you can, and nothing else at this moment, you can start down to be 100, to get down towards 100 feet above touchdown zone elevation. Then you got to see one other thing on the list. So that 100 feet above touchdown zone elevation applies to both non-precision and precision approaches. Although if the weather is really that gunky, you're probably not going to see the approach lights either if you're up at the altitude that most non-precision approaches fly at. But the way the reg reads, if you see the approach lights and nothing else, and you're at the MDA, you can start down. Now again, depends on where you're landing. Here we got a 9,000-foot runway. So just like we talked about with K.I. Sawyer, Marquette, Michigan, you probably can start descending down to 100 feet above touchdown zone elevation and still have plenty of runway to get landed on and stopped if you do end up seeing at least one other thing after landing here. So then, now back to our ILS approach. We get to 1,099 and our radios are still not working and we don't see anything. We don't see approach lights, we don't see runway, we don't see REILs, VASI, nothing. So now we got to go missed approach. So missed approach instructions are climb to 2,500 feet direct to Kinney and hold. So we're going to fly right straight out, go out to the Kinney intersection and hold there. So that, you know, for those of us with GPSs, that would be in our GPS. If we don't have that, all we have is DME, then we got to go all the way out to 22 DME and hold at Gorgie. And then if you're in this situation, we're going to probably do a teardrop entry into the hole. But there we are in the hole with no radios. So now what are we going to do? This is where you have to, if you have to declare an alternate, you want to be very, very careful when you're declaring an alternate, that it's going to be someplace that you can actually get to and that you're actually going to be able to, the weather is going to be good enough that you're going to be able to land at that airport. Because the only time you have to go to the alternate that you wrote on your flight plan is in this situation right here. You flew to your destination, radio out, you never broke out of the clouds, so you couldn't land there. You went missed approach, you went out and did the hold, and while you're in the hold, you're going to get yourself set up, and then you're going to fly direct to your alternate. And then hopefully the weather at your alternate is good enough that you can land there, because then the reg stops. There's no other discussion about what you're going to do after that. So now, we get off a ForeFlight here. Back to this slide over here. Back to sharing the screen. Back to that one. So now, this is the next question I ask my students, because I sat there and thought about one day, because I'm sitting there in the airplane doing my instructing thing, and the student's doing an absolutely wonderful job. So I just started looking around, and I looked at the way the airplane was set up, and we had comm 1, and in the exact same box is nav 1. And we got comm 2, in the exact same box is nav 2. I'm going, what happened, if the box is going to quit, won't the navigation side be gone too? So what happens if you have absolutely no communication, which is a reg 4, but because the way that our airplanes are set up now, we probably don't have any navigation information either. This is where they talk about in the regulations that you can't regulate everything. So now it's use your best judgment. What altitude are you going to fly? Nowadays, with the AROCA stuff listed on the chart, I'd at least fly above that altitude. Back in the days before AROCA was listed there, if I'm in the clouds, obviously in this situation, because if it's VFR, I just go land someplace. But if I'm in the clouds and I have no communication and no navigation, then I'm going to fly above the AROCA, probably at a VFR hemispheric altitude. Because if I'm in the clouds at a VFR altitude, there isn't going to be any IFR people flying at that altitude. I still got to believe in the big sky theory, so hopefully nobody's climbing or descending through that altitude while I'm out there flying around. But that's as good a choice as any. What heading are you going to fly? What is the weather like? Is there VFR weather someplace that you can go to? Way back in when I first started learning how to fly instruments, when we were talking about an IFR flight plan where we're actually going to be in an IFR situation, we'd always ask, where's the nearest VFR for this exact situation? If you don't have anything, how far do we need to fly to get to a point where VFR really is, so then we can descend and land? When I was teaching in North Carolina, and this is one choice for this example is head east, because North Carolina, if you go east, you're going to get out over the ocean. You start a nice slow descent. You break out of the clouds, you turn around, go back to the coast, and land at an airport on the coast. If the altimeter is getting close to zero, it's time to start pulling the power back and flaring because you're about to hit the water. But so that was something to do there. In Tennessee, when I was teaching there, the idea was to head west because you have the Appalachian Mountains on the east side, you have the Mississippi River on the west side. So if you head west and slowly descend down, it's probably a good chance you're going to break out of the clouds before you hit the ground. Here in Minnesota, especially in the Twin City area, we're like in the bottom of a bowl. All the altitudes, the altitude of the ground all around us seems to increase in all directions. So, for using my crystal example, I would not go south. I would probably not go east very much either, because that's where all the big airport stuff is. So I'd probably try to head north or west, and where all the big huge farms are, so that when I could descend out and hopefully get out of the clouds, I wouldn't, there's going to be nothing in the way out there. If you have ForeFlight or Garmin on your phone or your tablet, you might be able to use that information. It's an emergency. You can use that information to try to get yourself lined up with an airport someplace to come in for a landing. In our situation, if the whole communication side went down, that where everything's plugged into in the middle of the airplane, if that whole thing gave up the ghost, we'd also lose the transponder and the ADSB in. So there's a possibility we may not have a whole lot of information. But if your tablet's hooked up to the phone system, or you have your phone handy, you may be able to pull up weather information and that type of thing for even though the ADSB in is not working. So that, this is just a thought experiment. There's nothing written down anywhere that makes this the thing to do. It's just something that I've thought about, basically from the guy who taught me how to be a flight instructor. When I was going through my instrument training, he gave me this as a question. It's just something to think about. So, are there any questions? You can unmute yourself and ask the question if you have any. While you're thinking, thank you for attending. This is brought to you by Thunderbird Aviation, spelled wrong. And the FSDO FAST team is they're the ones that helped me get all this stuff, information onto the FAA safety.gov website. Future seminars, what did I do? The Great Minnesota Aviation Gathering is happening at the Buffalo Airport, May 20th and 21st this year. They didn't, the Minnesota Pilots Association is now partnering with the Seaplane Association, and so there's going to be a lot of speaking and stuff going on about about seaplanes and stuff. They have a whole. If you go to the Minnesota Pilots Association website, just search for Minnesota Pilots Association. You can find the stuff about the GMAG and all that stuff, and be able to find out what all the speakers are going to be. I'm not speaking there this year, but we will have a booth, so I'll be at the Thunderbird/Academy College booth on May 20th. If anybody are going to be over there and you have any questions that you want to talk about. The next safety seminar webinar coming out of Thunderbird Aviation will be on the second Saturday of June 11th. It's going to be anatomy of an aircraft engine. Our Director of Maintenance, Paul Block, is going to give an in-depth discussion about the inner and outer workings of a piston-powered, the piston engine that most of us fly with. Probably about May 31st, it'll be available on FAAsafety.gov for you to be able to sign up with. There's in the chat room here, always file IFR to initial approach fix as a best practice. That's really a good idea. When I was flying around south, but even though the weather was absolutely beautiful, I tried to go, I had a G1000 in the airplane I was flying, tried to go direct everywhere, and they always would give me another route to fly. Then when I got up in the air and say, can I go direct? And they say, yeah, you can. So one time there was nothing going on, and I said, how could I get direct from before I take off? The guy said, don't file to the airport, file to an initial approach fix, file to a fix on an arrival route, if there is one and you can fly it. Do something like that. Your better chances of getting direct to is better if you do it that way. Same thing with this. In a radio out situation, there's it's better to file to it to a initial approach fix, because that will make sure that but the trick is making sure you're picking the one that's for the weather that's going on that day. This will be this. I am recording this right now, and so sometime next week, my computer guru will load this onto the to the Thunderbird YouTube site. You just go to thunderbirdaviation.com. Over on the left side of the screen, when it comes up, will be a thing on seminars. You can click on that, and it will take you to where all the seminars are recorded. Any other questions? Again, thank you very much for coming. Next month on June 11th, we have another in our maintenance series with Paul Block. Sign up for that, and we'll see you at the airport.